The grand old building of the Ainsley Conservatory of Music didn't just make sounds. It held them. The melodies from the practice rooms soaked into the dark wood of the floors, and the heavy velvet curtains, waiting for the quiet hours to breathe them back out. During the day, the hallways were rivers of noise, scales on violins, arpeggios on flutes, the thunderous debate of a full orchestra. But after 6 o'clock, the river dried up, leaving only echoes. That was when she arrived. Her name was Elena. She was 16, with a quietness about her that wasn't shyness, but watchfulness. She moved through the polished corridors like a shadow, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. A few steps behind her was her mother, Maria, who pushed a wide, quiet cart loaded with sprays, cloths, and a heavy vacuum cleaner. Maria's keys jingled on her belt, a soft music of their own. She had been cleaning the conservatory for 11 years, since Elena was a little girl chasing dust motes in the late sunbeams. Their routine was a familiar dance. Maria would unlock a practice room, and Elena would slip inside, settling at the small desk in the corner under the window. She'd spread out her school books, math, history, science, and begin her work. But her real study was always the room itself. It was a small, square space with a high ceiling. The walls were scuffed from the cases of countless instruments. In the center, like a king on a tiny stage, stood a beautiful, if slightly worn, ebony grand piano. Elena never touched it at first. Not for a long time. It wasn't hers. Nothing in this temple of music was for people like her and her mother. They were the ghosts who came after, wiping away the fingerprints of talent, erasing the evidence of the day's work so it could all begin again tomorrow. Elena understood her place. She was the listener, and she listened to everything. Through the thin walls, she heard the students. She heard the girl in room 3A struggling with the same fast section of a Mozart sonata for a week, the frustration in her playing slowly melting into triumph. She heard the boy in 3C hammering out loud, angry chords, then going perfectly silent for minutes, thinking. She heard the soaring, confident runs of the advanced students, the ones who walked the halls with their heads high, their instrument cases like badges of honor. She began to see the music in her head. She could picture the sheet music, the black notes climbing up the lines. She could feel where the student in 3A was pressing the pedal too long, creating a muddy sound. She could sense when the angry boy in 3C finally connected to the emotion of the piece. The difference was that clear, even through a wall. She learned the language without ever speaking it. Her mother would move in and out, dusting the piano lid, wiping the windowsill. Sometimes, she'd hum a tune from her own childhood, a folk song from a sun-drenched village far away. That melody lived in Elena's head too, weaving itself into the classical fragments from the practice rooms. One rainy Tuesday night, everything was still. Maria was vacuuming the main hallway, a distant, droning song. No students were practicing late. The conservatory was a cavern of silence. Elena finished her homework and stared at the piano. Its lid was down, but it seemed to pulse with a silent energy. It was just her and the instrument. A crazy thought, a fluttery feeling in her chest, took hold. She stood up, her chair scraping softly. She walked to the piano and slowly, as if it might bite, lifted the fallboard, revealing the perfect row of white and black teeth. She pulled the little, worn bench closer and sat down. Her heart was a drum in her ears. This felt like trespassing. She laid her fingers on the cool, smooth keys. She took a deep breath and pressed down on middle C. The note filled the small room. It was richer, louder, more alive than she had ever imagined. It vibrated in her bones. She let it fade to nothing. Then she pressed the C an octave higher, then the G without thinking. Her right hand played the simple, 5-note folk tune her mother hummed. Her left hand, following an instinct she didn't know she had, found a few basic chords underneath it. The sound was clumsy, childlike, but it was asterisk music asterisk. Her music. A secret smile touched her lips. That was the beginning. It became part of the nightly ritual. When the coast was absolutely clear, when her mother was at the far end of the hall, Elena would practice. She started with simple things, figuring out the melodies she heard through the walls. Her fingers, which were long and clever from helping her mother wring out cloths and lift chairs, learned quickly. They remembered the shapes, the stretches. She never played when there was any risk of being heard. She became an expert in the sounds of the building, the click of the main door, the specific squeak of the janitorial cart's wheel, the footsteps of Ben, the nighttime security guard who did his rounds. Ben was a big man with a kind, tired face. He'd seen her grow up in these halls. One night, he opened the door to a practice room and found her, frozen, hands hovering above the keys. He didn't yell. He just looked from her frightened face to the piano and back. He gave a slow nod. "Sounds pretty," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Better than that screechy violin kid from last semester. My ears are still recovering." Then he winked, put a finger to his lips, and closed the door quietly behind him. He was her guardian angel in a uniform. After that, if Ben was near, she knew she was safe. Weeks turned into months. Elena's playing grew. She wasn't just copying anymore. She'd take the sad, slow movement she heard a student butcher in room for B and play it the way she felt. It should sound like a lonely walk home in the dusk. She mixed the technical exercises with the soulful rhythms of her mother's homeland songs. The piano became her diary, a place where the quiet, observant girl could finally shout, sing, and weep without making a sound anyone else could hear. One evening, the world outside the practice room door changed. Professor Sterling was working late. He was the most famous piano teacher at Ainsley, a man with silver hair and a spine so straight it seemed he was always poised for a performance. His students were the best, and his temper was legendary. He was in his studio, which was down the hall from Elena's usual room, grilling a nervous senior about interpretation. Elena, thinking the hall was empty, was lost in her own world. She was working on a phrase that had been stuck in her head all day, a stormy, rolling passage from something she'd overheard, combined with a rhythmic, pulsing beat from her mother's music. It was loud, it was passionate, and it was pouring out of her. She didn't play the notes. She asterisk through asterisk them at the piano. Professor Sterling, dismissing his student, heard it. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, his head tilted. It was raw, it was unpolished, but there was a power in it, a wild, untamed understanding of emotion that made his cultivated ear prickle. It was coming from the small practice room at the end of the hall, the one used by first years. He walked softly toward it, his expensive leather shoes silent on the wood. The door was slightly ajar. He peered through the crack. He saw a girl's back, her dark hair tied in a simple tail, her shoulders moving with the effort of the music. She was dressed in a simple, faded sweater. Not a student he recognized. Not any student at all, he realized, as he saw the worn janitorial cart parked just outside the door. He was about to push the door open, to demand what she was doing. When she finished the tumultuous phrase, there was a moment of ringing silence, and then, with a graceful, settled calm that shocked him, her hands formed a complex, beautiful chord, a rich, questioning harmony that resolved into something heartbreakingly sweet. It was a chord a master would use. It spoke of more than practice. It spoke of feeling. The sound hung in the air. As it faded, the girl quickly lowered the fallboard, stood up, and grabbed her backpack. She had heard something, her mother's cart, or Ben's footsteps. Professor Sterling stepped back into the shadow of an alcove. He watched as the girl slipped out of the room, touched the cart handle with a familiar affection, and melted around the corner with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the building. Sterling stood alone in the suddenly silent hall. The chord seemed to still vibrate in the wood, in the air. He looked into the empty practice room, at the pristine, silent piano. Had he imagined it a ghost? A trick of the acoustics? He shook his head, a strange, unsettled feeling in his chest. It was impossible. It had to be the cleaner's young girl? No. He walked back to his studio. But the music, that single, perfect chord, followed him. It was a question he couldn't answer, a note that would not end. The silence after that single, perfect chord didn't last. For Elena, life went on in its familiar rhythm, but a new, private melody had begun inside her. The piano was no longer just a beautiful object in the room. It had become a friend, a confidant. Her secret sessions grew longer, more daring. She started staying later, telling her mother she had extra studying to do. Maria, tired from a long day of work, would often nod and say, "Just be safe. Don't walk home alone," trusting Ben, the security guard, to keep an eye out. Ben became her unofficial lookout. He had a simple system. If he was doing his rounds and the hallway outside her chosen practice room was clear, he would walk past slowly, whistling a tune. If a professor or a late working student was nearby, he'd stop outside her door and give two firm taps on the wall. It was their code. Elena's ears became tuned to the building's sounds as finely as to the piano's. The click of a distant door, the particular sigh of the old elevator, the faint vibration of the pipes. She knew them all. She was a ghost who knew every creak in the floorboards of her haunt. She began to explore. She wasn't just playing the pieces she overheard anymore. She was taking them apart and putting them back together in ways that felt true to her. She heard a student struggling with a Chopin nocturne, playing it with a stiff, textbook sadness. When Elena tried it later, alone in the dark room with only the small desk lamp on, she didn't think of technical perfection. She thought of her mother's hands red and worn from cleaning solutions, yet always gentle when she smoothed Elena's hair. She thought of the quiet sigh Maria gave when she took her shoes off at the end of the night. That was real sadness, a tired, loving kind. She let that feeling sink into the notes, making the melody weep and yearn in a way the students never did. Other times, she mixed the music of her two worlds. She'd play the fast, running scales of a Bach invention, but with the driving, syncopated rhythm of the folk dances her mother sometimes described from her youth. The result was something entirely new, something that made her heart race with a strange joy. She never wrote any of it down. It lived in her head and in her muscle memory, a secret library of songs only she could access. One night, Ben didn't just walk past Wissing. He leaned in the doorway, his arms crossed, listening as she finished one of her hybrid compositions, something stormy and modern, that melted suddenly into a sweet, folk-like lullaby. "You know," he said, his voice soft so as not to startle her, "they pay people a lot of money to write music like that. The folks downtown, in the jazz clubs and such." Elena flushed, quickly putting her hands in her lap. "It's just messing around. It's not real music." Ben raised an eyebrow. "It's real if it makes you feel something. And it sure ain't the sound of someone messing around. That came from in here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "Don't let this fancy place tell you what's real. They just sell one kind of flavor. You're mixing your own. That's special." His words warmed her from the inside, but they also made the secret feel heavier. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a part of her she was hiding, and it was growing bigger every day. Meanwhile, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with music. Budget cuts were sweeping through the university. Rumors trickled down to the janitorial staff like cold drips from a leaky ceiling. There were meetings Maria didn't tell Elena about, but Elena saw the worry etched deeper into her mother's face. Maria came home quieter, the lines around her eyes more pronounced. The trouble came to a head on a Thursday. Maria's supervisor, a nervous man with a clipboard, came to find her while she was cleaning the main hall bathrooms. Elena, waiting nearby with her books, pretended not to listen from around the corner. "It's not personal, Maria," the supervisor said, his voice awkward. "It's numbers. They're cutting the evening cleaning crew by 2 positions. Seniority. You understand. Yours is the most junior of the night shifts." Maria's voice was steady, but thin. "I have been here 11 years. My daughter, I know. I'm sorry. The final decision comes from the building management committee next week. Professor Sterling is the head of it. He has the final say on non-academic staff for the conservatory. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. He's all about efficiency." The man's footsteps clicked away. Elena pressed her back against the cold tile wall. The world seemed to tilt. Their apartment, their food, her school, it all balanced on her mother's job. The thought of Maria coming home, defeated, the light in her eyes gone out, was worse than any fear Elena had ever known. And it was Professor Sterling, the man with the silver hair and the imperious stare. Who would decide? That name clicked in her mind. Professor Sterling, the piano teacher, the one whose students played with icy precision, the man who owned this world of polished wood and privileged sound. He was the gatekeeper, and he was about to lock her mother out. A cold anger, hard and clear, settled in Elena's stomach. She didn't cry. She walked out and took her mother's hand. Maria tried to smile, but it was a shaky thing. "We'll be okay, asterisk me vita asterisk. Something will turn up." But Elena didn't believe in things just turning up. They never had. Everything they had was earned with sweat and silence. The next few nights were the darkest. Elena couldn't find the music in her. When she sat at the piano, her fingers felt clumsy. All she could think about was the look on her mother's face, the way she stared at the bills on the kitchen table without seeing them. The beautiful, grand pianos now seemed like symbols of a world that could dismiss her mother with a stroke of a pen. It was Ben who finally gave her the key. He found her sitting on the floor of a practice room, her back against the piano, staring at nothing. "Tough week," he stated, sliding down to sit beside her with a grunt. Elena just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Heard about your mom," Ben said gently. "Sterling's committee meets tomorrow at 4 to review staffing." He said the last words with a sarcastic twist. "There's nothing we can do," Elena whispered, the words tasting like dust. Ben was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the grand piano looming over them. "You know," he said slowly, People like him, they speak a language. It's not the language of cleaning schedules or bills. It's not even really the language of words. It's asterisk that asterisk. He pointed a thick finger at the piano. That's how they talk. That's what they respect. That's the only thing in this whole building he truly listens to. Elena looked up at him, confused. Ben met her gaze. He heard you that night. Weeks ago. I saw him lurking in the hall after. He had a look on his face, like he'd seen a ghost. He didn't say nothing, but he heard you. He knows something's in these walls. Elena's heart skipped. Professor Sterling had heard her. The thought was terrifying, right now. Ben continued, his voice low and serious. He thinks your mom is a line on a budget. A number. He doesn't see her. He doesn't see you. All he sees is his music and his important students. Ben paused, letting his words sink in. The only way to make a man like that asterisk see asterisk you is to speak his language, louder and truer than anyone else in this building ever has. The meaning of his words crashed over Elena. He wasn't telling her to beg or to plead. He was telling her to fight, but not with shouts or tears, with the only weapon she had, the one she'd been hiding. He's in his studio tomorrow, Ben said, standing up with a soft groan. Late after the committee meeting, he'll be there. Thinking he's decided someone's fate, he looked down at her, his usual kind eyes now fierce. Make him hear you, Elena, not the cleaner's daughter. Asterisk you, asterisk. After he left, the room felt different. The piano was no longer just a friend. It was a tool. It was a voice. The cold anger in her stomach hardened into a crystal clear purpose. She stood up and sat at the bench. This time, her fingers weren't clumsy. They were charged. She didn't play a practiced piece. She played her worry, her love for her mother, her fury at the unfairness. She played the memory of her mother's humming and the sound of a mop bucket rolling across the floor. She played for the life they were about to lose. She played for their future. And for the first time, she played not for herself, but for an audience of one. The plan formed in her mind, terrifying and solid. She would not wait in the shadows for a verdict. She would walk right into the heart of the kingdom and play her truth. Tomorrow, after the committee decided her mother's fate, she would go to Professor Sterling's studio. She would play, not to ask, to show him exactly what his world was about to throw away. The day was a long, slow ache. Elena moved through her classes at school like she was wrapped in thick glass. The sounds of her classmates, the teacher's voice, the bell ringing, they all felt muffled and far away. All she could hear in her head was the music, the storm she was preparing to unleash. It played on a loop, a soundtrack to her dread and determination. Her mother went to work that afternoon as usual, her face pale but set in a mask of calm. She didn't talk about the committee meeting. She just kissed Elena's forehead and said, "I'll see you at home later." The words felt heavy, like they might not be true. Elena watched her walk away, the familiar weariness in her shoulders looking more like defeat. Elena didn't go straight to the conservatory. She went home first, to their small, quiet apartment. She stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the photos on the wall, her mother smiling. A younger version of herself, a picture of a sun-drenched village square from a place she'd never been. She looked at her mother's favorite chair, the one with the crocheted blanket thrown over the back. This was what she was fighting for. This simple, tired, loving peace. She changed out of her school clothes. She put on a simple, clean dress, the only one she owned that wasn't for school. It was dark blue and a little old, but it felt right. This wasn't about hiding in the shadows anymore. She was walking into the light, and she needed to be seen. The walk to the conservatory felt like walking to the edge of a cliff. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. Every logical part of her screamed to turn back, to accept whatever was coming quietly, the way they always had. But Ben's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, make him hear you. Asterisk. She slipped in through the side service entrance, the one her mother used. The halls were mostly empty, the last of the day students packing up. She could feel the weight of the building around her, the history and the privilege. She made her way to the wing where the faculty studios were. The doors here were heavier, with nameplates. At the end of the hall was a grand, dark wooden door. The nameplate read, asterisk asterisk Professor Sterling asterisk asterisk dot. She could hear voices from inside. Not just one. Her breath hitched. She hadn't expected an audience. She hid in an alcove, her back pressed to the cold stone, listening. There was Professor Sterling's voice, sharp and instructive, and two younger voices, a man and a woman, answering with yes. Professor in crisp, eager tones. His star students. Of course, a fresh wave of terror washed over her. This was worse. 1,000 times worse. To fail in front of him was one thing. To fail in front of them, these polished, perfect examples of everything she was not, would be a humiliation so complete she would never recover. The urge to run was almost overwhelming. Then she thought of her mother's hands. She thought of the supervisor's dismissive tone. Asterisk its numbers. Asterisk she wasn't a number. Her mother wasn't a number. And this music in her heart wasn't a calculation. The studio door opened. The two students walked out, laughing softly to each other, discussing a tricky passage. They didn't even glance at the girl standing in the shadow of the alcove. They walked down the hall and turned the corner, their voices fading. This was it. The door was slightly ajar. Light spilled out into the dim hallway. She could see a sliver of the room-rich carpet, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the gleaming curve of a piano leg even grander than the ones in the practice rooms. She didn't allow herself another second to think. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Professor Sterling was standing by a large window, his back to her, looking out at the evening. He was holding a cup of tea. The room smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and expensive coffee. It was full of things, awards in glass cases, signed portraits of famous musicians, shelves of leather-bound scores. It was the room of a man who owned his world completely. He heard the door and spoke without turning around. "Forget your notebook, did you? I told you. The dynamics in the second movement are non-negotiable." His voice was tired, irritated. Elena said nothing. She just walked. Her shoes, quiet on the carpet, carried her past a plush sofa, past a grand writing desk, straight toward the centerpiece of the room, a magnificent, ebony concert grand piano. It was like a sleeping beast, larger and more beautiful than any she had ever touched. The movement finally made him turn. He saw a girl in a simple blue dress walking purposefully toward his prized instrument. Confusion, then annoyance, flashed across his face. "You, stop right there. What are you doing? This studio is private. Are you a messenger? Leave the paper on the desk." Elena reached the piano. She ran a finger along its polished lid. It felt alive. "Did you hear me?" Professor Sterling's voice rose, taking on the tone he used with disrespectful students. "Do not touch that. That is a Bessendorfer. Now, get out before I call security." This was the moment. Her throat was so tight she couldn't have spoken even if she wanted to. She ignored him. She pulled out the velvet-covered bench and sat down. She could feel his shocked anger burning into her back. She lifted the heavy fallboard, revealing the expanse of white and black keys. They seemed to stretch forever. "Get away from there," he boomed, starting to move toward her. Her hands came up. She closed her eyes for a single second. She wasn't in a professor's studio. She was in her mother's kitchen, hearing her hum. She was in a silent practice room, feeling the ghost of other people's music. She was in the hallway, hearing her mother's job being reduced to a numbers problem. Her fingers came down. It wasn't a gentle start. It wasn't a polite scale. It was a crashing, discordant clash of notes from the very bottom of the piano, a sound of upheaval and fear. Professor Sterling froze mid-stride, stunned by the raw violence of the sound. Then, from the chaos, a melody emerged. It was the folk tune, her mother's tune, but it was wounded, limping, played with a heartbroken slowness in her right hand. Her left hand built a fortress of dark, complex chords around it, the kind of advanced, jazz-inflected harmony she'd figured out on her own, that Ben had said they paid money for downtown. It was the sound of beauty trapped, of a song trying to sing through a wall. Professor Sterling's angry demand died in his throat. His professional ear, trained for decades, was captured in spite of himself. This was wrong. It was technically all over the place. The posture was unconventional, but the emotion, it was pouring out of the instrument in a torrent he had rarely heard. It was unedited, raw passion. Elena began to build the piece. She weaved in fragments of things she'd overheard in his own classes. A snippet of a difficult Rachmaninoff passage, played not with icy precision, but with a feverish, personal agony. She transitioned into a furious, racing section, her fingers flying, not with the practiced ease of a conservatory student, but with the desperate energy of someone running for their life. The music swelled, filled with defiance, then broke apart again into the fragile, recurring folk melody. Now even more mournful. She wasn't playing a composition. She was telling a story. The story of silent halls and watching eyes. The story of hard work that went unseen. The story of a love that cleaned up after other people's dreams. Tears streamed down Elena's face. But she didn't sob. Her body was rigid with focus. She was inside the music, and the music was everything. She forgot about the professor, the room, the Bessendorfer. She was playing for her mother, in their living room, trying to say with notes what she could never say with words. Asterisk, I see you. I hear you. You matter. Asterisk, the final section began to calm. The anger spent itself. The left hand settled into a gentle, rocking rhythm, like a lullaby. The right hand took the simple folk tune and, with aching tenderness, let it sing out clean and pure for the first time. It was a love letter. It was a thank you. It was the sound of coming home. She ended on a single, high, clear note that hung in the air of the silent room, sweet and piercing as a star. Then, it was over. Her hands fell into her lap. She was shaking. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the faint, sympathetic ring of the piano strings. She slowly turned on the bench. Professor Sterling was still standing where he had frozen. His face was unrecognizable. The irritation was gone. The arrogance was shattered. He looked pale. He looked old. His eyes, usually so sharp and dismissive, were wide, fixed on her. He was seeing a ghost, but not a shadow. He was seeing a seismic event. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked from her tear-streaked face to her hands, resting in her lap the hands of the cleaner's daughter, and then back to the magnificent piano that had just spoken a language he understood perfectly, a language he realized, with dawning, horrifying clarity, he had been teaching wrong for years. The door to the studio creaked. Elena and the professor both turned. The two students, the man and the woman, were standing in the doorway. They must have come back for something and heard the music. Their faces were mirrors of stunned disbelief. The young woman had a hand over her mouth. The young man just stared, his earlier confidence completely erased. No one moved. No one spoke. The last, perfect note still seemed to vibrate in the air, in the bones of the building, in the shattered quiet of Professor Sterling's world. The verdict had been delivered, but not by the committee. It had been played on a Bessendorfer, by a girl who was supposed to be invisible. The silence in the studio was a living thing. It pressed in on Elena's ears, louder than the music had been. She could feel the stares of the two students in the doorway, could see the stunned, frozen expression on Professor Sterling's face. The wave of courage that had carried her to the piano bench was gone, leaving behind a cold, trembling emptiness. What had she done? She stood up. The velvet bench scraped softly on the floor, and the small sound broke the spell. Professor Sterling flinched, as if waking from a dream. Elena didn't look at him. She couldn't. She kept her eyes down and walked, not quite running, toward the door. The two students, the young man and woman, parted silently to let her pass. She felt their eyes on her like a physical touch, not hostile, but full of a bewildered awe that was almost worse. She hurried down the hall, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps, and didn't stop until she was outside in the cool night air, gulping it down like she was drowning. She walked home in a daze. The city sounds, cars, distant laughter, the hum of streetlights felt alien. All she could hear was the echo of her own music, and the terrible, deafening quiet that had followed it. She had meant to fight, to make him see. Now, she just felt exposed, like she'd torn her skin off in front of everyone. When she got home, her mother was sitting in her chair, the crocheted blanket over her legs, staring at the blank television screen. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. The committee. They made their decision, her mother said, her voice flat. They said they would keep me on until the end of the month. A transition period. She tried to smile, but it was a broken thing. A whole month. We have time to figure something out. Elena wanted to tell her everything. About the music, about bursting into the studio, about the look on the professor's face. But the words stuck in her throat. What good would it do? She had probably made everything worse. She just hugged her mother tight, smelling the faint scent of cleaning soap on her clothes. It's going to be okay, Mama, she whispered, hoping it was a promise and not a lie. At the conservatory the next day, everything was different and yet exactly the same. The students bustled to class. The sound of practice filled the halls. But as Elena walked in with her mother that evening, she felt the change. People didn't just glance past her anymore. They looked. Whispers followed her like rustling leaves. That's her. The janitor's girl. Heard it from Chloe. She was right there. She said Sterling just stood there like he'd been struck by lightning. The story had spread, twisted and turned into legend. She was a secret prodigy, a street musician, a ghost in the machine. The two students who had witnessed it, Chloe and Lucas, became reluctant celebrities, asked over and over to describe the impossible performance. Elena tried to shrink back into invisibility, but it was impossible. then found her while she was trying to do homework in their usual alcove. He gave her a broad, knowing grin. "Heard you made some noise last night. I think I made a huge mistake," she whispered back, her stomach churning. "The only mistake would have been staying quiet," he said firmly. Wait and see. She didn't have to wait long. Professor Sterling's personal assistant, a stern-looking woman, found Maria while she was emptying trash bins. "Professor Sterling wishes to see your daughter in his office tomorrow afternoon at 3. Maria looked terrified. She thought Elena was in trouble, that they would be thrown out immediately. Elena just nodded, a strange calm settling over her. The axe had been hovering. Now it was swinging. The next day at 3, Elena stood again outside the heavy wooden door. This time, she knocked. "Enter." Professor Sterling's office was less intimidating in the daylight, but only just. He sat behind his massive desk, not by the window. He looked at her, and his face was unreadable, a mask of professional calm. But his eyes were different. They were watchful, intense. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat on the edge of the stiff chair in front of the desk. A long silence stretched between them. He templed his fingers, studying her. "What you did," he began, his voice measured, "was the most extraordinary act of musical insubordination I have ever witnessed." Elena didn't know what to say. Was that a compliment or an accusation? "It was also a mess," he continued, a flicker of his old sternness returning. "Technically undisciplined, emotionally self-indulgent in parts." The phrasing in the middle section was chaotic. Elena felt a hot prick of defiance behind her eyes. She looked down at her hands. "However," he said, and the word hung in the air. "However." It contained moments of pure, uncut genius, a connection to the emotional core of music that cannot be taught. It is a raw diamond, all sharp edges and dirt. He leaned forward slightly. "I have spoken to the dean. Your mother's position will be reviewed again. She will stay. For now." Relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed through Elena. She looked up. "There are conditions," he said, raising a finger. "This talent cannot be left to wander the halls at night like a stray cat. It must be shaped, honed. You will begin formal lessons with me." Elena's breath caught. Lessons with him asterisk? The man who represented everything that had always been closed off to her. "You will start from the beginning. Scales, arpeggios, proper technique. You will learn the canon, the correct interpretations. You will, in short, learn to do it properly." He said it with finality, as if offering a great gift. He was offering to make her one of them. It was a lifeline. For her mother's job. For a future she never dreamed of. She nodded. Mutely. The lessons began, and they were a kind of torture. Professor Sterling was a relentless taskmaster. He crushed her intuitive, free-flowing style under the weight of tradition. "No, no, no." The composer marked it piano here. "Not the thunderous emotion you seem to prefer. Your fingering is atrocious. It is inefficient. Do it again. Forget that folk nonsense. We are focusing on broke precision." He wanted to erase the girl who played from feeling and replace her with a student who played from the sheet music. Every time she tried to put a bit of her own soul into a phrase, he corrected it. The piano, which had been her friend, became a field of landmines where every step could be wrong. It was frustrating and exhausting. She missed the quiet freedom of the empty practice rooms. The other students watched her with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. She was the charity case, the janitor's daughter who got the great Professor Sterling's attention out of pity or novelty. Chloe and Lucas, who had heard the raw truth of her playing, were the most conflicted. They could see Sterling trying to sand her down, and they weren't sure if they were watching a rescue or a demolition. Elena felt herself being pulled apart. One part of her was desperately grateful for her mother's safe job, for the incredible opportunity. The other part felt like she was being asked to kill the very thing that had saved them. The tension came to a head in a masterclass. Sterling was teaching in a small recital hall with a dozen of his best students watching. Elena was to play a Beethoven sonata movement. She had practiced it until her fingers ached, trying to play it exactly as he demanded, correct, clean, emotionally restrained. She started well enough, concentrating on the notes, the dynamics he dictated. But as the music progressed, something in her rebelled. The notes on the page felt dead. This was music about struggle and triumph, not about polite perfection. She could feel Sterling's critical eye on her. She could feel the other students waiting for the wild creature to make a mistake. In the middle of a passionate climb, something broke. Instead of pulling back as marked, she leaned into it, letting the emotion he called self-indulgent flood back in. Her left hand, remembering the rhythms of her mother's tunes, added a barely perceptible pulse to the rhythm, grounding the lofty music in something earthy and real. It wasn't the Beethoven of the conservatory. It was Beethoven filtered through the soul of a girl who knew what real struggle felt like. She saw Sterling sit up straight, his brows drawing together in a stormy frown. She knew she was defying him, in front of everyone. And in that moment, she didn't care. The music was asking for more, and she had to give it. She finished the piece not with Sterling's precise, tapered ending, but with a bold, ringing chord that spoke of defiance, not resolution. The last note faded. The room was silent. No one clapped in a masterclass until the professor spoke. Sterling stood up. His face was dark. That, he said, his voice cold and sharp enough to cut glass, was a complete betrayal of the composer's intention. It was arrogant. It was ignorant. You took a masterpiece and dressed it in cheap sentimental rags. The words were meant to wound. And they did. Elena felt her face burn. The other students looked down, uncomfortable. But then, from the back of the room, a single, slow clap started. It was Lucas. He wasn't smiling. He looked from Sterling's angry face to Elena's humiliated one, and he clapped again, steady and deliberate. After a heartbeat, Chloe joined him. Then another student. It wasn't a roaring applause, but a quiet, solid sound of respect. They had heard it. Not the mistakes, not the rebellion, but the truth in it. The truth Sterling was trying so hard to scrub away. Professor Sterling turned to see his best students applauding his worst humiliation. He looked, for the first time since Elena had known him, unsure. The control in his perfect world was cracking. He had the technique, the history, the authority, but Elena, the cleaner's daughter, had the music that stirred. The slow clap in the masterclass room didn't last long. A sharp, icy glare from Professor Sterling silenced it as quickly as it had begun. But the sound of it, that brief ripple of defiance, stayed with Elena. It was a tiny anchor in the storm of his disapproval. He dismissed the class with a curt wave of his hand, his anger a cold cloud in the room. He didn't speak to Elena. He just gathered his papers and left, the door clicking shut with a note of finality. Walking home that day, the old feelings of being an outsider rushed back, stronger than ever. Now she was an outsider who had embarrassed her only patron. She had traded her mother's job for this chance, and she had thrown it back in the professor's face. The guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. When she told her mother what happened, Maria simply took her hand. You played from your heart, me vita. A heart cannot be wrong. We will manage. We always have. But the next day, a different summons came. Not from Professor Sterling, but from the dean's office. The dean was a kindly, older man with bushy eyebrows and a calm demeanor. His office was warm and cluttered, less intimidating than Sterling's fortress of achievement, miss. The dean began, leaning forward on his desk. We have a situation. Professor Sterling is aggrieved. He feels his professional guidance has been publicly flouted. And yet, he paused, tapping a pen. Several of your fellow students have come to me, not to complain, to express admiration. They said what you played, while unorthodox, was the most memorable thing they've heard in a masterclass all year. They said it reminded them why they loved music in the first place. Elena didn't know what to say. She stared at her lap. Professor Sterling is a master of the canon, the dean continued. He produces brilliant technicians. You seem to be something else. The conservatory's purpose is to nurture artists. The question is, how do we nurture an artist who doesn't fit the mold? He proposed a solution, an audition, not a normal one. It would be held in the small recital hall. The panel would be himself, Professor Sterling, and 2 other music faculty. There would be 2 pieces. One, a classical piece from the standard repertoire, chosen by Sterling, to be played with proper technique and respect for the score. The second piece was to be her own, an original composition. Let us hear the voice Professor Sterling is trying to train, the dean said. And then, let us hear your voice. We will decide on a scholarship and your future here. Based on both, it was a compromise and a test. It felt like being asked to stand with one foot into different worlds, unsure which would hold her weight. The following weeks were a strange, split existence. Her lessons with Sterling continued, but they were colder, purely technical. He assigned her the 3rd movement of a Beethoven sonata complex, fiery piece that was a mountain to climb. They worked on nothing else. He drilled her on every note, every fingering, every dynamic marking. It was about control, precision, proving she could obey. She practiced it until her fingers felt numb. and the music sounded like meaningless noise in her head. But at night, after her mother was asleep, she would sit at the small, slightly out-of-tune keyboard they had rented years ago for a month and never returned. Here, she worked on her own piece. She didn't write a title at first. It was just the sound of her life. She started with the slow, rhythmic squeak of a janitorial cart's wheel, translated into a deep, repeating bass note. She built the lonely, echoing hallways with high, haunting notes that seemed to question the silence. Then came the fragments, the ghost of a phrase from a practice room, the warm ribbon of her mother's folk tune weaving through, the stormy anger of feeling invisible, and finally, a simple, rising melody of hope that wasn't bright, but was solid and real, like a clean floor after a long night's work. She called it, finally, The Cleaner's Nocturne, a night piece. Word of the special audition spread. It became an event. On the afternoon it was scheduled. The small recital hall was not empty. The dean had allowed any interested student to attend. The room was full. Chloe and Lucas were in the front row. Then the security guard stood at the back, arms crossed, a solid presence. Her mother sat in the second to last row, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. Wearing her best dress, Professor Sterling sat on the far left of the panel, his face a stern mask. He looked like a king attending the trial of a rebel. Elena walked onto the stage. The lights were hot. She could see the sea of faces, curious, skeptical, some friendly. She saw her mother's worried smile. She sat at the grand piano, the same one from the master class. For a moment, the fear threatened to paralyze her. Then she thought of the silent practice rooms. She thought of Ben's whistle. She thought of her mother's hands. This was just another room. She had played in the dark for an audience of ghosts for years. Now she would play in the light. She began the Beethoven. It was perfect, technically flawless. Every note was in place, every crescendo and diminuendo exactly as the sheet music and Professor Sterling demanded. It was powerful, impressive, and as she played it, she felt nothing. It was a magnificent suit of armor, empty inside. She finished to polite, respectful applause from the panel and the students. Sterling gave a single, slow nod of approval. He had won. He had proven she could be molded. Elena did not stand up to bow. She placed her hands back on the keys. She took a deep, shaking breath and closed her eyes. When she began the Cleaner's Nocturne, the difference was instant. It wasn't just a different piece. It was a different person playing. The first, deep, rhythmic notes set a scene. The high, questioning notes that followed created a space, not a concert hall, but a lonely, vast building after hours. The audience, used to hearing sonatas and etudes, leaned forward, confused, then captivated. Then the melodies began to dance. The classical fragment, once stiff, now sounded lonely and searching. The folk tune entered, and it was like a warm light switching on in a dark room. Elena's body moved with the music now, not with the rigid discipline of Beethoven, but with the natural flow of someone telling a story. Her face, which had been still during the first piece, showed the journey, the concentration, the memory of sadness, the flashes of quiet joy. She played the stormy section, the sound of frustration and defiance, her fingers flying but never losing the thread of the story. And then, the resolution, not a triumphant blast, but that steady, gentle, rising melody of hope. It was the sound of work done well, the sound of a mother coming home, the sound of a secret that was a secret no more. She ended softly, with the folk tune and the deep cartwheel note fading together into a peaceful, resolved silence. For a long moment, no one made a sound. Then, from the back of the room, came the sound of someone crying quietly. It was Elena's mother, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. That sound broke the spell. The applause didn't start with a clap. It started with a standing ovation from Lucas, then Chloe. Then, like a wave, the entire student section rose to their feet. The sound was not polite. It was explosive, emotional. They were applauding the story. They were applauding the truth. The faculty panel was slower. The dean stood, a wide smile on his face, clapping warmly. The other two faculty members rose, nodding, impressed. Finally, slowly, Professor Sterling stood up. He did not smile. He did not clap with enthusiasm. But he looked at Elena, really looked at her, for the first time without anger, without criticism, without the lens of his own methods. He saw the girl, the piano, and the overwhelming reaction of the room. He gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't approval of her methods. It was a soldier's salute to a worthy opponent. It was respect. Afterward, in the buzzing hallway, the dean found Elena and her mother. The scholarship is yours, he said simply. Your mother's position is not only secure, but we are creating a new role for her, head of evening operations, a promotion. He turned to Elena. Your lessons will continue, but with a revised approach. You will work with Professor Sterling on technique, and with another professor on composition. We will nurture both sides, the technician and the artist. Elena didn't feel a surge of victory. She felt a deep, quiet peace. She had not conquered the kingdom. She had simply carved out a room of her own inside it. That evening, she didn't go to a practice room. She walked the halls with her mother, who was inspecting the doors with a new, proud authority. They stopped outside Professor Sterling's studio. The door was open a crack. From inside, they heard not a student playing, but the professor himself. He was playing a simple, unfamiliar folk-like melody, experimenting with it, trying to understand its shape. Elena and her mother shared a small, knowing smile. They continued walking, their footsteps echoing together in the grand, quiet hall. The ghosts were gone. Now, they belonged